Remnant from the Ashes is a co-op Souls-like third-person shooter that features a set of procedurally generated levels and a few randomly generated bosses. And while it falls short on a few aspects, the game is still a really enjoyable experience that offers a good amount of variety and replayability, once you get past the first few hours. So, Remnant from the Ashes follows your character on a journey as they travel to different realms in search of a way to stop the Root, which has destroyed the world. The concept is fine, although nothing particularly special, but the worlds are really what shine here, as most of the different realms do a great job carrying a very mystical, enchanting vibe, and it's a great infusion of past and future technology. This desert area in particular feels so ancient and primitive on the surface, yet the undergrounds are filled with these elaborate, futuristic mazes. You have this corrosive, toxic swamp, these sprawling underground caves, this giant magical forest. All this stuff is really captivating. And then there's the starting area, which just feels completely lacking compared to the rest. It's not bad by any means, but it just feels so basic and uninspired. It's a pretty standard looking post-apocalyptic world on the surface, and below it's filled with sewers which, well, they're sewers. There's only so interesting they can look. The enemies in this area also don't look quite as good as the others, and in general, it's not a great start to the game. After about 2 hours, I was already starting to tire of it, and I was really hoping it would kick into gear. Thankfully, once you finish this area, it instantly picks up and it was constantly engaging throughout the rest of the game. One big thing that I should mention is that the level design of the worlds are procedurally generated, which means that while the overall look and style of the world will be the same, the layout will be slightly different every time. This is certainly a decent way to mix things up, but you will find that there are a lot of assets that are reused across the board, and that's what will always happen in procedurally generated games. It's just how those games are made. Now, this isn't fully a bad thing, and I like the variation you can get on different playthroughs, but I just can't help but wonder if this game would have been better if they had just straight up designed the levels. That way you can make sure everything flowed exactly as you wanted, and you didn't have any room for less interesting variations. I found that after finishing each area, I always remembered what that area looked and felt like, but I never really remembered the layout of it, as even on the same playthrough it can blend together a bit. There were even multiple times where my friend and I got lost exploring the world because it looked like we had already been here before.
Wait. It's already open.
This is the same.
Did we go back into the same spot? No, it wasn't the same. Because we went here and then we went across down there. But where do we go now?
And it doesn't help that the map is so tiny and there's no way to zoom in on it. Now, I don't want to make it seem like I completely dislike the idea of randomization here, and as I'll mention in the gameplay, it offers some great variety, but it's just something that I couldn't help think about, so I wanted to mention it. Narratively, Remnant has a decent enough plot to keep things moving, and the voice acting was all really good, but the storytelling feels too sparse to be really impactful. There are usually only like 2 cutscenes/dialogue moments per area, one when you get there and one when you leave, and it really suffers when it comes to the notes and lore. Throughout the game, you'll find journals thrown about, and the stories within them are surprisingly interesting, but the problem is that they are so few and far between, and when you find one, there's usually about 15 pages worth of entries, which is just too much for one journal. Stopping to read 15 different entries in one go kinda takes you out of the action and slows up the pace. The story also has a pretty flashy and eruptive finale, which is cool visually, but it's not exactly hard-hitting in the narrative sense. Now, I know this is a Souls-like game and the story isn't the main focus here, so I'm definitely not crushed or anything that it wasn't amazing, but because there's a decent enough premise, it definitely could have been told better. What we get here is fine for the game though, and the different realms are very engaging, aside from the first area. So, Remnant is a third-person RPG based around fighting lots of different bosses and building up a character. It also features co-op, with up to 2 players being able to join your game. The main combat is focused around shooting with a decent arsenal of guns at your disposal. The gunplay is tight, the weapons feel good to use, and the majority of enemies are pretty fun to fight. There are also some melee weapons, but melee combat certainly takes a back seat here, though as with most RPGs there is a ton of different character traits, weapon mods, and armor pieces that will allow you to make different character builds, so a more melee focused build is entirely possible. The game is also a Souls-like in that it has a health and stamina bar, features an Estus Flask type of healing, and is built around traveling to new areas, killing hordes of enemies, looking for new items, and having a boss battle or two, with several optional sub-bosses filling out the corners of the world. Now, this is where the random generation really works well, as the sub-bosses can be completely different depending on how your world was generated. Each boss also has a special crafting part that can be used to craft a new weapon or a weapon mod, and killing certain bosses in different ways can net different rewards. For example, killing this dragon regularly will unlock the Spitfire, but shooting its tail off first will give you this sword. I really like how this stuff works, and it certainly incentivizes replaying the game to go for different bosses or different items and build up your character even more. And for the most part, I found combat and leveling to be pretty engaging. But the game does falter when it comes to balancing all that, as the difficulty can feel uneven at times. In general, the moment-to-moment gameplay is mildly challenging on normal, fairly challenging on hard, and very challenging on nightmare. But the bosses are kind of all over the place. Several of the sub-bosses are nothing more than one-trick ponies where all you need to do is dodge their blatantly telegraphed attack, shoot them a few times and they'll die incredibly fast. But at the same time, the game also has some terrific boss battles that are pretty challenging, with the bridge standoff being the highlight. This one was absolutely crushing at first, but after several tries, we picked up on the pattern and we were able to take it down. It was a great fight because there were several moving parts and it required the player to actually learn the mechanics as opposed to just simply dodging a single attack and shooting. Some of the other good bosses offered up a swarm of enemies that you had to avoid, or at least some more big flashy encounters to make it interesting. Most of the main bosses I thought were at least good, with some great ones thrown in there, but only about half of the sub-bosses were good. The rest were just way too easy. Though your mileage will vary a bit based on the randomization you get. But on the whole, I'd say boss fights are pretty good, with some lows and some highs. Overall though, the gameplay is really fun, the upgrade system works pretty well, and it offers enough variety to entice you to replay it. Unfortunately, this game is a bit buggy with some weird issues that pop up. When playing in co-op, there was a pretty frequent bug where my partner would become invisible when loading into new areas. In order to fix this, he would have to quit to the main menu and then rejoin my game. There are also some issues with colliders on certain objects, as there are a few times where an enemy's attack would go completely through the wall, which is pretty irritating. Then there were a few other bugs like random T-posing, no lip syncing, and randomly catching fire, but those weren't frequent enough for me to really consider them to be a negative, though I still wanted to mention them. What is frequent though are drops in the frame rate. This game just isn't very consistent when it comes to performance, usually floating around 70 to 120 FPS for me, with many stutters below that. But then for some reason when you get to the second half of the swamp realm, everything goes to shit and it becomes almost unplayable, dropping into the 30s at times. I have no idea why this happens, but across all systems this seems common. I'm playing at 1080p running on an RTX 2080 and a Ryzen 7 1800X, and I dropped this low, and my friend, who's playing at 1440p ultrawide on an RTX 2080 Ti and an 8700K, said he was going from a usually locked 90 to as low as 50. This is certainly not a deal breaker, as this is a relatively short section of the game, but it feels absolutely terrible and I'm not quite sure why it seems so bad. Oh, and the game also has toggle sprint, but no option to turn it off, which is a bit annoying for me personally. Remnant is a really good looking game that kinda offers a bit of a mix between cel shaded and realistic. It's certainly not hyper stylized by any means, but it kinda has more of an artistic look to it than just straight realism, which I think helps with the fantasy of the world. The characters' faces don't look very good, but the environment is well detailed and the textures are solid, aside from these weird stretched out images in the background. It also has a pretty good use of color, and I particularly like the look of some of these caves. When it comes to the music, it's a bit on the subtle side, but I did like what was here, and I think it worked well for the game. Nothing that will get stuck in your head, but solid nonetheless. And aside from the enemies in the first world, I really liked the creature design, especially some of the bosses. Overall, a really good looking game. So, Remnant certainly has its fair share of issues, and I'm still a bit mixed on whether or not I think the procedural generation was completely necessary, but the majority of it is really fun despite that. The moment-to-moment gameplay is pretty engaging, and I love the different worlds, aside from the first, which again isn't bad, just a little bit boring. It's a really solid game that I ended up playing through more than once, so I would definitely recommend it if you're into Souls-like games or are looking for something to sink some hours into. It's also only $40, and I would be very interested in seeing a sequel. Thanks for watching, guys. If you've already played the game, let me know what you think of it. Hit that like button if you enjoyed the video, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. I make a wide variety of gaming content, and I put out videos weekly and sometimes more frequent than that. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video.